John Trumbull painted a life-size George Washington commissioned for the city of New York. Before the completed canvas was moved to its permanent place in the Common Council room at City Hall, a surprise viewing was arranged at the President's Mansion. This, of course, was in the very early days when the capital was in Manhattan. For much of that August, a deputation from the Creek Nation had been in the city to negotiate a treaty. Washington spent time in those weeks both sitting for Trumbull and negotiating with the Creeks, and he was struck by the juxtaposition of Trumbull, Harvard graduate, son of a colonial and also revolutionary governor, London-trained man, something of an ambassador. He had some small State Department roles, but clearly a man of refined manners, a sophisticated guy, in comparison to the Creeks, who were far from savages, of course, but they did definitely live in a world apart. Trumbull thought them exotic, as you can see from this little pencil sketch here. Washington thought them noble. That was his word. The president conceived a modest anthropological experiment. As later Trumbull told the story, the president was curious to see the effect the painting would produce on the Creeks' untutored minds. He therefore directed me to place the picture in an advantageous light facing the door of entrance. At Washington's invitation, the Indians arrived at 39 Broadway to dine with the president, who greeted them formally in full military regalia. After the meal, Washington invited them to walk through the house. When he reached the painting room, he opened the door to the room abruptly, without advising the Indians what they would encounter. According to Trumbull, they started at seeing another great father standing in the room. They were for a moment mute with astonishment. At length, Trumbull tells us, one of the chiefs advanced toward the picture and slowly stretched out his hand to touch it, and was still more astonished to feel, instead of a round object, a flat surface, cold to the touch. He started back, says Trumbull, with an exclamation of astonishment. Ugh! Another Indian then approached and placed one hand on the surface of the painting and another behind, and he was still more astonished to perceive that his hands almost met. Now, some of these men, like many other colonial Americans, be they white, Native American, African, had never seen any sort of painting before, not to mention a good one. Now, this story, which is recounted in Trumbull's autobiography, 40 years later, it has the polish of an after-dinner anecdote, and it's kind of thick with a sort of condescension that maybe we're not so comfortable with today. Nevertheless, it encompasses how much would change during George Washington's life. Now, this book is about the painters, but it's also about George Washington, who I think is, despite all the books written about him, still a difficult man to understand. And I regard all of the portraitists that I talk about in this book, and I couldn't talk about all of them because we know there are at least 28. But they were sort of my colleagues in this process. And I want to look at a couple of critical portraits by a couple of the most important painters. The first was painted by Maryland's Charles Willson Peale, a man of immense likability and many talents, by the way. His personal story is he was born in Maryland. His father was a convicted felon. He embezzled money from the English post office. His father died relatively young, but not before fathering quite a number of children, and left Charles Willson Peale's mother and Charles as the oldest son to bring up the family. He, as a consequence, was pretty early on apprenticed, as an early adolescent, to a saddler. He, at some point, acquired himself a watch. It broke. He didn't have the money to have it fixed, so he taught himself clock and watchmaking. He also worked with wood and brass. He taught himself upholstery work. And then he saw two bad landscapes. Wait a second. Let me give you a look at the sky. There it is. And at age 21, he found his vocation. Kind of late in life to start becoming a painter. But he was not to be deterred. He met up with an itinerant portrait painter by the name of John Hesselus, and he watched that Hesselus execute 2 portraits, and then Hesselus painted half of one face and supervised Peale as he painted the other half of the face, in return for which Peale made him a saddle, by the way. Now, genteel Neapolitans, he lived in Naples, underwrote a visit for Peale to England. Clearly, he demonstrated some genuine talent. In England, he trained under the expatriate Pennsylvanian Benjamin West, who was the history painter to George III at that stage. And he learned the tools of the trade, including the porte crayon, which is effectively a pencil. It's a very thin brush, a little metallic tube that you see he's holding in his hand there. He learned how and what the other brushes were, how to use them, palette, canvas prep, mortar, and pestle. Of course, in those days you had to mix all your paints yourself, so we learned about the varnishes and the oils and the pigments, and all that had to be done. When he came back after a bit less than 2 years in England, he brought with him this portrait, which was painted by Benjamin West, and he also brought with him a painter's chair, which is a chair mounted on a pivot that enables the sitter to be shifted as the light of the day changes without moving the fabric, because at that point painting the fabric of a woman's dress and so forth is critical to conveying the significance of that person or that family and the culture. So, and also, by the way, the painter's chair, as in the title of my book, obviously. Now I'm going to read you a piece from the book, speaking of the book, about a 1772 portrait of a country squire, a Virginia gentleman, who had already served his country, that is to say, England, in the French and Indian War. He was in retirement at Mount Vernon, and this would be his first portrait. Peale's portrait was Washington's first. Despite the novelty of the experience, he found no joy in having his picture taken. The process, he later said, put him in a mood that was both grave and sullen. Even so, Washington came to like Mr. Peale. He couldn't help but wonder whether, given his own inability to concentrate, the painter would be able to capture much of his character. I fancy the skills of this gentleman's pencil will be put to it in describing to the world what manner of man I am, Washington wrote. His concern was well placed, as his lethargy was revealing itself on the canvas in his bland, expressionless look. He was a man whose eyes flashed with intelligence when he became engaged in a conversation, but whose gaze went dormant when his mind wandered. As a trusted adjutant later observed, his countenance, when affected either by joy or anger, is full of expression, yet when the muscles are in a state of repose, his eyes certainly launch animation. It was indeed the detached Washington that Peale recorded. Washington's laconic pose for Peale betrayed little of the physical presence that impressed those who met the Virginia colonel. When he entered a room, he filled the doorway. He stood taller than most of his contemporaries, but his stature only partly explained the sense of quiet power that he exuded. He had the shoulders of a woodsman. Though he was thin through the chest, his long, box-like trunk was wide and unmistakably solid. He had very large hands and feet, thickly muscled limbs, and bulky thighs strengthened by countless hours straddling a horse. Yet the man in the picture seemed unfocused, his body slack. He was not in peak physical condition, and Peale faithfully recorded a missing button on Washington's waistcoat, the fabric strained by the soldier's growing midlife girth. But his sitter's pear shape was also the result of Peale's penchant for sweeping curves. Anatomical accuracy was less important to the artist than an appealing picture with overall grace and appeal. Peale would paint Washington repeatedly, at least 7 distinct portraits and multiple copies of pretty much all of those. There was one painted during the Constitutional Convention. There were a couple painted during his presidency, as well as during the war and before the war. It seems to me this portrait should be here where it was for a long time, but it went away along with George Washington Parke Custis after Martha's death, when he went upriver and built himself that fine house up there in Arlington. Speaking of Washy, as he was known in the family, I want to talk about an image in which he appears, one painted by this man, whose name is Edward Savage. He's a Massachusetts boy, born in Princeton, where my father was also born. A completely irrelevant, but possibly interesting note. Savage was perhaps the least naturally gifted painter of the bunch, if you see what I mean. He had volunteered to the president of Harvard. He was a silversmith, actually, by training, wanted to be a painter, went to the president of Harvard shortly after Washington had been elected president, said, "Don't you want a picture of Washington in your Hall of Worthies?" And President Harvard, his hands were tied, had to say yes. So Savage went down to New York, represented himself as coming from Harvard and wanting a picture, and painted this picture, which in itself is, not so interesting. However, in a journey to London, Savage got the idea for a big picture, which was 7 years in the making. It's called The Washington Family. Probably many of you know it hangs in the National Gallery. It is, in our historical terms, a conversation piece, which is synonymous with group portrait. And Savage described it this way. The general is seated by a table, dressed in his uniform, which represents his military character. His left arm rests on the papers, which are suitable to represent his presidentship. Mrs. Washington sits at the other end of the table, holding the plan of the federal city, pointing with her fan to the Grand Avenue. Miss Custis stands by her side, assisting in showing the plan. George Washington Parke Custis stands by the general, his right hand resting on the globe. Note, by the way, Billy Lee, George Washington's body slave, goes unmentioned in this description, but he's standing over there. There's a relationship that I'd like to know more about. They went to war together. Probably Billy Lee was the second best horseman in the Revolutionary Army after George, who was reputedly the best. He was the only slave that Washington freed in his lifetime. And personally, I think he probably inspired Washington to make that decision to free his own slaves, all the rest of his slaves, at the end of his life. But I don't know that that's true. That's just on the basis of nothing but my reading of human nature. Anyway, George Washington's 64th birthday came around, and this painting went on display at the Columbian Gallery in Philadelphia on Chestnut Street. And for 2 bits, a not small amount of money at that point, you could come in and see this painting. And for visitors, for those who came to look at it, the effect of Savage's family was unique and fresh, not just because of its size, not just because a conversation piece, a group portrait was an unusual, very unusual thing at that point, but the audience found a larger American vision in this painting. Because here's Washington, a childless man, yet father to these children and a founding father. The attentive viewer would also perceive that the subject of the painting is twofold, because behind the people is a grand view of the American landscape. And it's not George Washington who's at the center of this piece. It's the landscape. It's the people. It's a vista of America's natural beauty that is the focal element. I think it's interesting to compare this painting, this conversation piece, if you will, to another Savage painting, which would be categorized as an architectural, also in the collection here at Mount Vernon. It is, of course, Mount Vernon, Palladian in style, with the main block at center, flanked by the pavilions on either side, linked by those wonderful curved hyphens. George Washington brainstormed this house and the landscape. And originally, this painting, also by Edward Savage, was a pure architectural. But at some point, the figures were added, or so most people believe, and I do too. I don't know that it's provable, but I think it's so. And we don't know exactly who they are, but almost certainly that's George and Martha on the left, probably with the granddaughter, Nellie. Almost certainly that's, along with the dog over there, that's George Washington Parke Custis. And is that Lafayette? Is that Light Horse Harry Lee? Who knows? But somebody in a uniform. But I like to think of these two paintings together. The genius of Savage's masterpiece, The Washington Family, is that it offers his most essential insight, and that is that the public wanted to see Washington in his context. That is, they're very different paintings, the two of them are. One is a modified architectural, the other a conversation piece, but they provide a sense of Washington at home and a picture of his home at a distance. Same figures are seen, but distributed differently. Those who saw the two images together, and they were hung together at the first museum exhibit, probably the first museum exhibition ever in New York, and people who saw them came away with a sense that they knew the general a great deal better. He was no monarch. No formal audience was required to see this man. He was a family man, not so different from a million other heads of households at the turn of the 19th century. And to understand the general, who revealed so little of his private feelings, this was a useful, if imperfect, window. Moving on, I must talk about Gilbert Stuart. He's worth a lecture by himself, and that will happen at 10:15 tomorrow when Ellen Miles speaks, and you're in for a treat. I'm going to offer a narrative gloss over what I'm sure will be her deeper look at the artist. He was self-destructive, a drunk, a snuff addict. He was actually born in a snuff factory in Rhode Island. He was probably manic depressive. The art historian Dorinda Evans has made a very persuasive case that that's the case. Nevertheless, he was almost certainly the best painter of this bunch. And ironically, his best paintings don't tend to be his Washingtons. Nevertheless, the most reproduced painting in history is his Athenaeum portrait. Looks a little bit familiar. It is actually based on this. This was commissioned by Martha to be, along with a portrait of her, to be pendant portraits to hang here at Mount Vernon, which they never did because Stuart didn't deliver them to Martha. After Martha died, he refused to hand them over to Washi. In fact, he kept the portrait of Washington on the door of his studio. By then he was living in Boston. And he referred to, well, first of all, he regarded the paintings as a legacy to his family, and eventually they were sold to the Boston Athenaeum for the sum of $1,500, the two Martha and George portraits, and thus the name Athenaeum portrait, because the two of them hung at the Boston Athenaeum for many years. But he also made many copies of them over a period of close to 30 years before his death in 1828. And he referred to those copies as his $100 bills. Because you could come to him and say, I want a portrait of Washington. The painting of it was hanging on the door. He'd take off, put it on the easel, adjacent to the easel with the first canvas. In the course of one morning, he'd lay the preliminary paint on. In the course of the second morning, he'd finish it. You could take it away, and he would be in snuff and alcohol for a while with the $100 bill that you gave him. This is the third, and perhaps the least useful of the three Washingtons. I say that because it's not George Washington's body. It's probably a stand-in. The best guess, I think, is that it's Stuart's landlord's son in Philadelphia, who was much shorter and squatter than Washington. He doesn't look like the Washington that we think we know. And the head is more or less the Athenaeum. Nevertheless, this was a very important commission. A well-to-do merchant family in Philadelphia named Bingham commissioned this to be given to Lord Lansdowne, who was the first Brit to stand up on the floor of Parliament and say that he thought maybe the Americans weren't just terrible rebels, but maybe there was something to be said for their side of the argument. So we liked him. And this was to be a gift to him, thus the name of this as the Lansdowne portrait. I was in London a few weeks ago and revisited one of my favorite London museums, the National Portrait Gallery, and the only American hanging on the wall that I could find was this guy. And it's actually not a Stuart. But at the time, there was good reason to believe that Washington was the best known and the most admired person in the world. That's part of the reason he's hanging on the wall at the National Gallery in London, one guesses. Note, by the way, that the English curator in drafting this identified him as a Virginian, a citizen of a British colony at the time. Anyway, Washington was famous, but the Lansdowne painting specifically became an icon, just as later the Athenaeum portrait would be with its appearance in the dollar in the early 20th century. An important element in the ascendance of the standing portrait, the Lansdowne portrait, occurred in 1814, and it involves another story. Kurt alluded earlier to a book I published a couple of years ago about the War of 1812. And writing that book meant I got to hang out for a couple of years with Dolly Madison. And she was great. She was more fun than George, actually, but don't tell anyone I told you. The portraitist of the era liked her too, including Gilbert Stuart. This is she. She's still young in this picture, age 36, and if you'll excuse the anachronism, she was a bit of a babe. Certainly unafraid of displaying her décolletage. But if we look at her more seriously, you can see her gaze is direct and intelligent. So is she. There's personality here, a slight smile. Is that look appraising, do you think? Or is it open and interested? But Dolly Madison is probably best remembered for 1 hour on the afternoon of August 24th, 1814. There's a battle raging in Bladensburg where the British have made their way across the bridge, and unfortunately the American militia have run to the hills, badly outmanned and outmaneuvered. It's a rout, and that means that the British are coming, that is to say they're marching on Washington. Back at the President's house, while this is going on, Dolly's holding dinner for James. She expects that James and his cabinet are going to come back. They actually had the oddest cabinet meeting, probably in history. Actually on the front line at Bladensburg, he and Secretary of War, Secretary of State Monroe, several others, had this meeting on horseback as they were waiting for the British to do what they were going to do, which, as it happens, was rout the Americans. And Dolly thought that they were going to come back. She hoped victorious from this battle. It didn't happen that way. Instead, a messenger arrives, a freed slave by the name of James Smith, and brings word from Mr. Madison that she should flee, which eventually Dolly Madison does, but not before she deals with George. We've just looped back here. She refused to leave the general behind. She thought that if the English took the White House, which wasn't called the White House then, it was called the President's House, but if they captured the President's House and this painting was there, it would be a fine finish for them. She didn't want them to get that advantage. So she ordered that the Lansdowne portrait, which was hanging on the wall in the dining room, be removed. Turns out it wasn't as easy as it looked, and a couple of servants had to take a couple of hatchets to it, reduce the gilt frame to kindling before this canvas on a stretcher was freed. She handed it over to a couple of New York merchants who would come by to offer their assistance, and they took it off to safekeeping to Darn in Maryland. And only then could Dolly go down to the street side, climb in her carriage, go to Georgetown, and eventually take a ferry across to Virginia in safety. It's a good story, of course, one that conveniently, if ironically, positions Mrs. Madison at the threshold of a new era. The world she knew, and the world Washington knew. He liked her, by the way. He thought she was great. He thought she was lively and fun and attractive and all kinds of things. He liked women. The world she knew depended upon painters to portray the famous of the day. Her act of heroism was perhaps the climactic moment when a canvas meant more to the nation than it ever had or would again. Keep in mind, because the passage of a few years also brought us this. This is Dolly later on. But photography, whether compliments of Louis Daguerre or a Matthew Brady or anyone else, isn't our subject. Painting is. And of course, George Washington and how he, because of his images, had and has extraordinary standing. In the last several weeks, without even trying, I've seen in newscasts figures from our time. Obama standing in front of the Lansdowne that's in the White House with the Prime Minister of Israel. Another day, the Prime Minister of India standing not so far from this image right here, the famous porthole portrait painted by Charles Wilson's son, Rembrandt. He's a presence, George is, for lots of reasons, but these portraits are key to that presence, I think. In closing, I'd like to go back to the Athenaeum portrait, an image that has become so familiar it's been referred to in the literature as the household Washington. The unfinished Stuart canvas is enigmatic, but with close study, the viewer can realize that the general, nearing the end of his life, has begun to relax. His duty is nearly done, spending the year before he left the office of the presidency. We are looking at a man on his way home after a very long journey, and perhaps he has his eye on posterity. Again, I think the effort to intuit his character is important, because to understand the America he contemplated, shaped, and helped to invent, we must seek to understand him. If he was the midwife at the birth of his country, he was also the unavoidable presence in American painting as it emerged. In early America, many regarded portraits as ungodly, and in effect there was no artistic culture in the early colonies. But in Washington's time, art moved from the drawing room and went on display in galleries and public buildings. Charles Wilson Peale helped make admiring likenesses popular, as the obliging man painted likable pictures of the well-to-do to display in their home and assure that they would be remembered after they were gone. John Trumbull's aspirations were even loftier, and he prided himself on painting nothing less than history. Savage, whose flair as a showman was undoubtedly greater than his skills with brush, nevertheless reached a larger public. His audience was the emerging middle class, men and women who could identify with his big painting of America's great hero and the many prints that he made of it. The stolid, determined, rugged, dogged man the painters recorded became the paradigm of the founding father, more than Jefferson or Adams or Hamilton or any of the others. None of them had the unimpeachable mix of gravitas, selflessness, and implied power. In the age before photography, he left no negative legacy. He was, as his friend Eliza Willing Powell once told him, the only man in America that dares to do right on all public occasions. The Washington we know today, through his words, the testimony of others, and in the pictures the painters made of him, offers proof positive of his instinctive, pragmatic, and quintessentially American character. He was also the man who always, admittedly with an air of resignation, agreed to sit for yet another portrait. That willingness alone, no small thing, meant everything to the early painters. But I've talked long enough. I hope our idiosyncratic wander through portrait time has whetted your appetite for what's going to be happening in the next several talks today and tomorrow, and for more looking and listening and learning. I imagine we all share an engagement with history, and I know that connecting with the past has become one of the principal joys of my life. And it's happened because I've learned to look at things. And in places like Mount Vernon, one learns to consider the context of those things and of those objects, to look for their stories, and by those means, perhaps to grasp something of the meaning of the past, which I also think better enables us to think about the future. I think that's why we're here, don't you? Thank you, folks. Do we have time for a question or two? I think so, if there are questions. Sir, back row.
It's my understanding, I've read that Gilbert Stuart didn't really like Washington all that much, and that he also had so few teeth in his mouth when he painted the picture that's on the dollar bill that they had to put cotton in his mouth in order to puff out his cheeks. Is that any truth to that?
I think that Gilbert Stuart was someone who had a certain disdain for pretty much everyone. Kind of unhappy character, I think. Although I think it is also true that the first time he saw Washington, he was prepared not to be impressed by him, and he was, if not struck dumb, nevertheless he was deeply impressed by the man. So I think it's a little more complicated than you've characterized it. I've not heard the story about failing his mouth full cut. I would have said that those teeth were adequate to do that puffing thing, but I don't really know. You might tomorrow. Ellen Miles knows more about Gilbert Stuart and her small finger than I do in my darn person. So ask her.
Thank you.
Front row, please.
In your research at this period of time, what length of time when they sit for somebody are they tied up for? And do they multitask or anything while they're posing? Because he was obviously a busy man.
Yes. I think it's pretty variable, the amount of time, and there are certainly people who sat for many, many, many hours. I think typically 5 hours plus or minus, usually on several separate days. I think that was fairly typical. But I think they really kind of had to sit there and pay attention and look at the painter. You know, a painter has to see you fixed in place. And it is also true, however, that conversation was critical to this. One of the reasons that Charles Wilson Peale took as many portraits as he did and was the popular man that he was is that he was delightful company.
To loosen him up? Or
Yes, I think he made people feel relaxed. And I think that Gilbert Stuart was also a very good raconteur, very well-traveled man. I mean, he'd been ridden on a rail out of several towns for not paying the bills, including London and Dublin. So anyway, so I think there was definitely an exchange, but I think it did involve a lot of kind of solitary sitting too. Should we do the microphone over here? Again, front row.
Did he ever express whether he had a favorite painter or one who he enjoyed more than others and would sit more for do multiple paintings?
Well, I think he really liked Charles Wilson Peale. Everybody did. But it's also true that he was willing to cut Gilbert Stuart quite a lot of slack because I think at some point Martha was putting lots and lots of pressure on Gilbert Stuart to finish the paintings, which of course he never did, and to hand them over. And there is, in the literature, there's a reference to them going one day to Stuart's studio over in Germantown saying, could we have the paintings? And him saying, no, you can't right now. And George saying, oh, Martha, be cool, this is okay. It's fine. So I guess I don't know the answer to that question, but I think he was a pretty patient man, was George, and I think he found them both quite engaging.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. And I was curious, with the tradition of portraiture in Europe, was there, and at what time did that become a tradition in the U.S. the way they had Reynolds and Gainsborough and others? Or did it become more of a middle class thing, or not? Was it we didn't have the same kind of class system?
Right. Well, there were very few portrait painters here until the 18th century. There was a quite well-trained painter in Boston named John Smibert, who died in 1851, which is why I used 1851 earlier and explained the span of time that I cover in this book. But essentially, it was impossible to make a living painting portraits. Most painters, even in England, lots and lots of the portrait painters were also sign painters, also did other kinds of painting tasks, because of course you had to know how to use the materials and so on. So making a living as a painter was a pretty dodgy thing. And it was really only in this generation that anyone really succeeded at some level in accomplishing that, with the likes of Trumbull and Stuart and Peale. And I think it gradually filtered down to, I should also say that one of the things that Trumbull and Savage also did was they tried to supplement their painting income by making prints of their works. And that was somewhat successful. You made a few bucks selling a few prints, but I don't think it was ever quite as successful as they would have liked. But I think it was, much later that it became a broader base kind of across the culture, that people could, more than the absolute upper-crust middling types, middling folks were not having their paintings, not having their pictures painted at this era. Yes.
Was there one of the portraits that George thought would have captured him better than any of the others? And likewise, do we know if there was one that Martha thought captured George better or worse than any of the others?
You know, I think George kept his counsel to himself pretty well. But I think it was a consensus within the family that the Houdon likeness, which is to say not a painting at all, but a sculpture, was the very best likeness of Washington. Everybody seemed to agree that was clearly the best. And it is an absolutely wonderful piece of work. And I wonder, I mean, one of the interesting things about here in Mount Vernon, when you go through the dioramas, some wonderful scholarship that's been invested in creating the George Washingtons that are represented at several different times in the course of his life. And that's based on kind of triangulating everything that is known about Washington, which includes a study of the portraits, which includes examination of the surviving fabric, the clothes he had. And I don't think we really know exactly what he looked like. But you look at the Savage portrait, and you look at the Charles Wilson Peel portrait, and it's almost hard to know it's the same man. And also, if you look at a lot of Peel portraits, a lot of these people look kind of a lot alike. So I think we have to, plant it in our own minds of what we like and what we feel, and maybe imagine what George favored.
And how about Martha? Do we know if Martha?
I don't know. She may have put word to paper about that, but I don't know what she did.
The idea of portraiture for money, with the Savage exhibiting the conversation piece.
Yes.
I know that Vanderlyn did Versailles, Cyclorama that was going to be done for money, and Cropper doing
Yes.
it. But were any of the other Washington portraits done for money, for exhibition at some point? And how did Savage manage to convince the Washington family, how would you like to have me paint your portrait, and then I'm going to exhibit it and make money from it?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Washington understood he was a public man, and that was important. And I think there's this funny thing. I'm inclined to think that it was important to him because he thought it was the right thing to do. Maybe he wanted to be famous. Maybe he wanted these, acclaim and power. Maybe he had some sort of ambitious desire. But it's always seemed to me in all the writing, the reading I've done about him, that he really had a very strong public service gene that led him to do many things that he didn't want to do, including come out of retirement after the war and become president. He really didn't want to do that. He didn't necessarily want to come up and sit at the Constitutional Convention either. But he did that because he thought he should. I think the same is true of him sitting for all these paintings. He thought it was necessary. He thought it was important to distribute his likeness, to enhance his presence in the culture.
I have a question about when did Washington's portrait become common in the households in the United States?
The person who was following me here, Wendy Reeves, is going to be the person to answer that because she knows a staggering amount about the various prints that came along. And there were many, many, many generations and many incarnations. And some of them were based on Peels and some of them were based on others. But she will give you a much more sophisticated answer to that than I. I think we're nearing... I think we've come to the end of the Q&A round. I'm going to be around. So thank you very much.
Watch the camera here.
We're going to take a brief break, and we'll be back in 15 minutes, right back here. Your name badge will allow you to get a free soft drink, bottled water, or coffee in the food court directly across.
They told me you came in this way. Okay. Now, did you see me?
Yeah.
promise. That one is
I went to UVA's, your office in Alderman. That's right, yeah. Okay, I used to go up there and study.
Yes, you do. Thank you. Yeah, I got a little, well, I got held up at work. We ended up having several things.
I think, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Found in my mind, finances. But James F. Lanier is my great.
No problem.
Trying to do it just.
Yeah, I do. I'm blind as a bat.
Well, with my glasses, it's like people rarely have the same prescription, you know what I'm saying? I got a few people with glasses. So. Yeah, and it doesn't matter. You can bring it down. Obviously, it doesn't matter. No, I had to adjust because I'm so far back. When they lean back, it actually touched, even though I was like this far away. So it should be good.
No, you were dead on some lab. All the way back.
And it's kind of, I don't know who's going to be sitting in there. The screen is pretty bright. You know what I mean? So it's like, and that guy was like leaning, so he'd be sort of like out and then into the screen. So
But you know, my family,
dealer's choice, you know, for Iris.
I'll let the director.
Yeah, close enough.
Good enough, sir.
Oh, appreciate it.
No problem.
I'm feeling like a little bit better every day, which is good. You know, I have, like this morning I got up, I wasn't like super duper stiff. I could feel, you know, a little bit, but like at night I can feel it. But it's good though. I've never had like a chronic injury where, you know, just like lasts for more than like 2, 3, 4 days. I've had real bad sprained ankles and shit like that, but that's an injury. You know, that's going to get better.
Most cases.
Like with the knee, you don't know. That could be a chronic thing where it just keeps going for years, you know, or something, you know, like a disc type of thing, same thing. So, okay.
No, so far,
I want it to last at least 5 or 6 more years.
I understand.
You know what I mean?
I do.
Like I want to keep working for a little while.
We've all done it.
You know.
Woohoo! Sorry?
Yeah, that was cool.
Absolutely.
No, I like that. Yeah, very good. Yeah, I like that. Like the War of 1812, we did so much of that stuff for like 5 or 6 weeks. I must have done 10 different things. And I learned a lot. I learned we've done some like Maryland Historical Society stuff over the years that I really enjoyed. So I like read more about it.
Yeah, I was glad to see this spotlight on that era because there's so much, you learn Civil War, you learn Revolutionary War, you're lucky in school, and that's about it. So it's good to have, focus on that, change some, like Burning of Washington.
I didn't know that was like a body double, probably.
I didn't know that either, but when you look at it, you see the little band.
Yeah, a little different maybe, especially compared to the original portrait from was it 17?
Well, I can change it if that's tomorrow, but it's not mine, so you want to talk to that man later.
You're welcome. The curator.
Right. Yes. Oh, yeah.
All people kind of hang around.
They had some really cool stuff.
That's
War of
magic.
1812 exhibit. You saw that? I shot a bunch of stuff. We did a whole thing on that. So I was down there for hours, like all day. They had some really nice that Dolly Madison portrait. And they had Dolly Madison's dress. The red dress, it was probably made from the drapes. The red, because back then it was like you just couldn't get material off the rack. So it was like some silk drapes, red silk drapes they got from Paris. So that was probably, and they had the actual dress there. They had the portrait of the guy, Ross, General Ross, who was from Northern Ireland, was a British general who was killed in Broadpoint in Baltimore. And he hadn't been killed, actually. He was like the British very well might have taken Baltimore. But since he sort of like randomly got shot by a Maryland militia guy. But it was cool that his portrait was a really nice portrait, and he'd been in the house in Northern Ireland, the family house, for more than 200 years. And they lent it to the National Portrait Gallery, which was really cool. And just to know that was like, wow, that's really cool. I like that. Yep. Just arranging my usual Friday night party with my buddy Pat. I've been over there in a couple of weeks between my back. Last week I went up to, where? He's got good stuff. Chevis is like first piss compared to Pat has. Pat's got it. Oh no, I mean there's nothing wrong with it. More to the bourbon. He's got a great, he got this great bottle. It's like a huge bottle of this, and it says, Gentleman Jack, and it is Gentleman Jack. It's just personal stock of Patrick J. Carroll. I mean, it's like a gallon bottle. He got it somewhere. Somebody told him. It's a giant bottle of Gentleman Jack. You buy Gentleman Jack and just pour it into it. It's like a huge decanter, but it's big. And it looks really nice. Oh yeah. That's good. That's good stuff. You don't like bourbon, I guess. I love bourbon. Gentleman Jack. Nothing wrong with that.
Let's see. House, there's a free double. I'm around, good to see you. How's things going? The bigger one was the talking about the and Alba too. Worked on the Black Jones
Oh, good.
Wendy with the read.
Let's get started. Say that.
Good, good. Well, let's see you soon.
She's not there. Well, maybe I'll go back out if I can't catch her coming in.
Learn anything? Good idea.
Hey, Al, go tell me real quick.
You good?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
Good things aren't gonna happen. I feel like spraining an ankle or
I'm not quite sure what. Something's going on.
I'm here. There you go. I take tips.
Way to the right.
I haven't had that one used on me.
I wonder if that's Jim Jones passed away. He used to be the general facility. I don't know. How do you show it? Two E's or an EAS? Yes. Yeah. You'll find a gentleman in that room. Honey, you want to go? Oh, you can't go in there. Okay. My cousin Bob is he talks a lot. Can we hold that for you, ma'am? Yes. Okay.
Careful with the finger.
I know you. You know, with the TV light, comfort light. The darker it is out there, the more light. Makes it comfort. You know what I mean? Like in a studio or something, it's dark and you're reading concert, you put a light on the background. Just because it's not very contrast. It's real dark, it's like it's tough to see. It's brighter.
Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Scott, known to many people here as Betty. Together with my husband, Stanley D. Scott, I'm a serious enthusiast for George Washingtoniana of many varieties, including portraiture. We have collected all of our adult lives, as were several members of our families, Scotts and Sabins, before us, and they acquired a number of surveyor drawings, medallions, coins, rare books, stamps, and medals, as well as documents on the subject of George Washington and his time. We have been active supporters of Mount Vernon for several decades and are members of its Connoisseur Society. This lively group is dedicated to supporting the acquisition, preservation, and conservation of Mount Vernon's remarkable collections. It's very encouraging for us to see you all here at this crowded seminar because it indicates an interest in coming closer to the iconic presence of our first American president and his character, charisma, and his abilities. We met Wendy Wick Reeves, our speaker, in the early 1970s, and we were impressed then, in the early 70s, with her comfort and obvious affection for her specialty, American graphic arts. It is a pleasure to tell you a little bit about her. She is a leading authority in her field and the senior curator of prints and drawings at the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery. Wendy earned her master's degree from the Winter Program in Early American Culture at the University of Delaware. She is a member of the Print Council of America. In 1974, she started the Graphic Arts Department at the National Gallery, and the collections she developed included fine prints, rare books, drawings, cartoons, caricatures, and posters. Wendy has curated many exhibitions, lectured widely, and served as the interim director of the National Portrait Gallery from June 2012 through March of 2013. Her long-standing interest in George Washingtoniana started with a traveling exhibition of 18th century printed portraits accompanied by her own book, George Washington, American Icon. She has authored books and published articles on 19th century portrait drawings, celebrity caricatures, and the editorial cartoons of Pat Oliphant, about whom she'll tell you a little bit more in a moment. Her book, Eye Contact, Modern American Portrait Drawings from the National Portrait Gallery, has been nominated for awards for distinguished scholarship in the field of art history. Wendy's present exhibition and accompanying book of her own are titled Face Value, Portraiture in the Age of Abstraction. She will speak to us now and elucidate on how George Washington's contemporaries saw him. Please join me in celebrating this opportunity to learn more about a somewhat elusive subject from an expert, Wendy Wick Reeves.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Betty, for that lovely introduction. It's such a pleasure to see you again, and such a pleasure to be with all of you at Mount Vernon. I am honored to be here with so many Washington enthusiasts and so many very knowledgeable speakers on the subject. Could we have the lights down a little bit? Is that possible? Well, we hope that will happen. You'll see it a lot better. Vain Britons exulted the lyrics of a favorite new song in the American camp entitled Washington. Boast no longer with proud indignity by land your conquering legion your matchless strength at sea, since we, your braver sons, incensed, our sword have girded on. Huzzah, 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 for Ward and Washington. The rebels, the next verse proclaimed, laugh at all your empty puffs, and so does Washington. These cheeky lyrics are printed on a broadside, adorned at the top, as you can see better in the detail, with a pair of relief-cut portraits, assumedly Washington on the left, and on the right, Major General Artemus Ward, whom one writer described as heavy-set and pious-looking. George Washington's patient willingness to pose for artists produced for future generations multiple portraits made from life to help us understand the man who anchors so much of the nation's founding history. We will examine many of these lifetime portraits and sculptures over the course of this symposium. My goal today is to take you beyond those artists' discerning eyes to suggest another view of Washington that circulated broadly through all levels of society during his own day. What these images lack in refinement, they make up for in patriotic fervor, which has interesting implications for the nature of Washington's leadership and the dissemination of his fame way before the posthumous myth-making began. At the beginning of the Revolutionary War, pictures of emerging heroes were eagerly sought, even for inexpensive publications. But likenesses were dubious, or at least only very roughly insinuated. Indeed, this broadside was probably preceded by the appearance of the two profiles on Bickerstaff's Boston Almanac for 1778, where the caption leads us to believe that they depicted the glorious Washington and Gates. The right profile could indeed originally have been made to represent not Artemus Ward, but Major General Horatio Gates, who was also round-faced and double-chinned. And the pair may have been cut for some earlier, now lost piece of ephemera when Washington and Gates, his adjutant general, first arrived in Boston to take command of the Continental Army. Despite the variability of identities, the struggling colonists desperately needed heroes. And more than anything, they needed to believe in the commander-in-chief. So let's examine this fascinating Pennsylvania German almanac, published in Lancaster in 1778 for the following year. In the middle, let's remember, of a very discouraging war where news from the battlefield was rarely good. So what can we discover about George Washington in the iconographic jumble of the pictorial cover? Some of the imagery pertains to almanac making. Sun, moon, zodiac, an astronomer up front, and a rider on horseback carrying a calendar, another word for almanac. A multi-masted ship of commerce metaphorically connects the old world, conveyed by a vaguely medieval town and classical ruins, with the new world, represented in the left background by a bow and arrow toting brave in front of Indian longhouses, and in the right foreground by a bare-breasted native princess. But hovering prominently above this iconographical melee is the allegorical figure of Fame, holding an oval-framed portrait labeled Washington. From the mouth of her trumpet emerge the words, Des Landes Vater, the father of his country. Is it perhaps the first usage of that particular honorific? The profile can't be said to represent a likeness, and Washington is quite tiny here, but he wears a laurel wreath and bears that weighty title, with its implications of founder, progenitor, commander, and substitute for a king. So, in the pictorial imagery, Fame has a good grip on Washington, both literally and figuratively, from an early point in the war, even before he had fully proved himself as a commander. Curiosity about emerging American heroes existed in England and on the continent as well, where wildly fictitious likenesses were even easier to perpetrate on an unknowing public. One egregious example was a set of English mezzotints of Washington and his generals published in the 1770s by C. Shepherd and Thomas Hart of London. General Charles Lee serves as one example here. With some variations in pose, the Americans all resemble each other with their tricorn hats, wide lapels, sashes, gorgets, and pudgy faces. The mezzotints spun off copies and variations, such as this illustration depicting Washington from an impartial history of the war in America, published in London in 1780. Printmakers in America also struggled to supply the demand, but they often added a proud patriotic gloss and remarkably frequently looked for an authentic likeness. Charles Willson Peale, as we have already heard, was a crucial early purveyor of Washington's face, and his reach was enormously extended through prints. Peale knew Washington. He had painted him in 1772 in the uniform of his Virginia militia. In 1776, he painted him again, both in a 3/4 length portrait and a miniature. But Peale also thought he would try a print. He had learned mezzotint engraving while in London from 1767 to 1769. There, his maiden efforts were guided by expert London printmakers and supported by a thriving industry, which included technicians to prepare the plates, skilled printers, and a consumer market. The mezzotint, and I'm taking you back to the print of Charles Lee as an example, was a technically demanding process. The metal plate was first roughened all over by a rocker and sharp tools. The engraver then worked in reverse from black to white, burnishing down the sharp points of metal on the prepared plate to create lighter tones and highlights. Everyone admired the English mezzotint, prizing its range of tones from dark, velvety blacks to soft grays and bright whites. The technique was especially suitable for portraiture, and considerable money could be made. So, Peale thought he would give it a try back in America, noting in his diary on October 16, 1778, began a drawing in order to make a mezzotinto of General Washington. Many generations of collectors searched for Peale's first effort, the long-lost mezzotint of 1778, and the Portrait Gallery was thrilled to finally identify one in the early 1990s. Its modest size and lack of pretension disguise its import. Of course, making a mezzotint in America was especially challenging. Peale complained about the quality of available ink and paper and the difficulty of obtaining copper plates. He wrote to friends abroad, seeking to help securing supplies. There were no technicians to do the tedious rocking of the plate, or skilled printers to produce the engraving. And Peale's prints do reveal a coarser grain than you would find in an English mezzotint. But though he didn't quite achieve that velvety richness, Peale had the skill to translate his personal knowledge of Washington from his paintings to his prints, retaining all the animation of a life portrait. We have a sense of a direct and personal experience here between the artist and the sitter that term implies. The lifelike expression feels completely authentic. I like to think that this modest image reveals something about Washington's character, as Peale had assessed him in 1776. Most Washington portraiture, of course, dates from after the war. This is a rare insight into the pre-war Washington. To me, that face exudes an almost youthful countenance, as well as a calm, mature demeanor that does help us understand the man stepping forward to assume the heavy burden of the commander-in-chief. Peale's papers reveal that he struck over 100 impressions, presenting them to friends and statesmen and advertising them in the newspapers. But the charming little print was facing some competition and didn't sell well. A pair of engravings attributed to Joseph Hiller Sr. after a Peale painting depicted Martha Washington and a 3/4 length image of the commander-in-chief in full uniform with the smoke of the Battle of Charlestown, Massachusetts behind him. Peale himself was going to have to up his game, and he did. By 1780, he had produced his own 3/4 length military portrait of Washington, based on a new painting from life produced for the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania in 1779. With a flag, cannon, attendant, and a view of Princeton in the background in reference to his victory there, the painting was a popular and inspiring image of a military leader, and a good candidate for Peale's second effort at a mezzotint portrait. Again, Peale has produced here a life portrait of remarkable authenticity and insight, depicting his subject with grace, dignity, and confidence. As a print and as a portrait, it is unexcelled among the early graphic images of George Washington. Eventually, in 1787, Peale would produce his third mezzotint portrait of Washington, after his own portraits. Including prints of Lafayette, Franklin, and Reverend Joseph Pilmore, he did finish 4 mezzotints in the series and sent a set of them to Washington. But he still had to prepare his own plates and do his own printing, and the sales were disappointing. He ultimately abandoned his plan as too much work for too little return. But we haven't quite finished the story of that small mezzotint of 1778. One admirer of Peale's little print was the English-born engraver John Norman, who had arrived in Philadelphia from London around 1774. The enterprising Mr. Norman, with various portraits, advertised frequently in the newspapers, billing himself as an engraver of watch cases, maps, portraits, landscapes, frontispieces, architectural illustrations, bills of lading, and numerous pictures and documents. He also taught engraving, printed copper plates, and sold almanacs, children's books, coffin, furniture, and frames. In August 1779, he advertised an elegant head of General Washington, undoubtedly Peale's little mezzotint. He himself was not a particularly skilled artist, but he was an ardent copyist and became an enthusiastic purveyor of Peale's Washington likeness. He advertised one of his first attempts in 1779, a primer adorned with a beautiful head of Washington. The ubiquitous primer, often the only school book available for colonial children, had traditionally been illustrated with a portrait of the English king. Norman was probably the first to substitute the new American hero. Within the limits of his abilities, his engraving was a close copy of the Peale mezzotint, imitating the long oval face turned slightly to one side, almond-shaped eyes looking straight forward, the curl of hair at each side of the head, the truncated oval frame, and even the highlight on the long nose. Just a few months later, Norman repeated the Peale face, this time using it as an ornamental heading for a single-sheet broadside almanac. Advertised in the Pennsylvania Packet on September 16, 1779, the Philadelphia Almanac for 1780 featured the face of Washington. Norman embedded the simple portrait in an elaborate pictorial surround of his own invention, complete with banners and cannons, garlands and cartouches, 2 trumpeting bare-breasted figures of fame, the seal of Pennsylvania, and a shield with a rattlesnake, a well-known symbol of the rebellious colonies. Another snake slithers across the bottom. Right about this time, Peale moved to Boston. He may have been encouraged in his departure by a public spat with a former partner. Norman appears frequently in the Philadelphia newspapers and this dispute also plays out in the public press. He was the sort of fellow who nowadays would get into a whole lot of trouble on Twitter. But at any rate, his presence in Boston and his sale there of the Philadelphia Almanac encourages a profusion of copies. The first printmaker, so inspired, appears to be none other than Paul Revere, who probably produced this relief-cut image for Weatherwise's Town and Country Almanac for 1781. The pamphlet almanacs were frequently illustrated with crude images, cut into the soft type metal, and printed in relief, much like a woodcut, along with the type. Revere's portrait is more elaborate than most, and while it doesn't have the detail of Norman's engraving with its elaborate allegorical and symbolic setting, it does incorporate the peel face with 2 fluffs of hair, the long nose, and almond eyes. And it is framed with an oval surround ornamented with Norman's swags, cartouches, banners, and cannons. Over the next 2 decades, the Revere cut passed from one publisher to another, used repeatedly for almanacs or for various editions of the New England Primer. Last time I researched it, I located this very same little cut in 17 different imprints, but there were undoubtedly more. Furthermore, the relief cut spawned its own imitations. At least 4 different copies of this one are known that illustrated numerous other almanacs and primers. So here we have the Federal Almanac for 1792. This maker seems to have had less of an understanding of the principles of light and shadow. But the face, the hair, the banners, cannons, cartouches, and swags remain. In the next version, here appearing in the Citizens and Farmers Almanac, there is still less artistry. But it is better than the Conehead version in the Columbian Almanac for 1798. The swag here has turned to metal and the cartouches look like jelly beans. But the cannons and banners still convey a touch of military swagger. For all of its failings, it could even be called admirable compared to this last example, a pitifully crude rendition appearing in Boston primers and almanacs and broadsides of the 1790s. But you will note that even here there are some vestigial remains of uniform, oval surround, cartouches, swags, and banners. No doubt it wasn't hard to guess the identity of this by now unrecognizable portrait. Those embellishments around a long oval face must have been deeply ingrained in the public consciousness. Meanwhile, our friend John Norman continued to produce his engravings, spreading his enthusiasm for Washington. This print of the Commander-in-Chief, paired with an accompanying image of Martha Washington, was published in 1782. The inscription underneath credits as the source a drawing by Benjamin Blythe, a Salem, Massachusetts pastel artist, which was in turn based on a painting in the possession of Governor Hancock. That would have been the portrait painted for John Hancock in 1776 by Charles Willson Peale. So Norman is sticking with his Peale-inspired face, to which he adds many of the embellishments familiar to us from the Philadelphia Almanac. Unfortunately, perhaps for his reputation, Norman didn't stop there. In 1783, the Continental Congress had voted unanimously that, quote, an equestrian statue of General Washington be erected at the place where the residence of Congress shall be established. He was to be depicted not only on horseback, but in Roman dress, wearing a laurel wreath. Norman, who struggled to depict cannons and banners, must have considered horses in Roman costume beyond his skill set. But he was an enthusiastic copyist, so to approximate ancient dress, he dug up an engraving from John Gillam's Display of Heraldry, first published in 1611, and came up with this. But he can't win every time. But let's give Norman credit for being one of the young republic's most enthusiastic purveyors of images, the commander-in-chief. And you will note he has used the by now very familiar long oval peel-inspired face of his hero. The visual culture of wartime America was limited, which is how an energetic and imaginative engraver with only modest skills found opportunities. He was one of the publishers of the new Boston magazine, for which he engraved the plates, and produced for the April 1784 issue this image of Washington. Once again, Norman's ambitions exceeded his talents, perhaps. Here he chose to copy his magazine illustration from an engraving of Montesquieu, published in a French volume of 1772. On the inside cover of the Boston magazine, he explains his allegorical conception, and I quote, "Nature stands ready to strike the lyre, while the genius of liberty presents a medal of the illustrious man who hath defended her standard in the New World." We can also recognize here Fame in the lower left corner and the blindfolded Justice with her scales in the lower right. While those were familiar allegorical details, the multi-breasted nude female called Nature is less so. And yes, if you look closely, there are several bare breasts lurking awkwardly behind that lyre. They symbolize nature's fecundity and, by extension, the prosperity of the new nation that Washington's victory made possible. This particular allegorical figure, it is fair to say, was ill-considered. Maybe it worked better in France. Besides, by the mid-1780s, competition was growing. Some large, handsome French and English prints of Washington were appearing on the market in American cities, many based on replicas of Peale's paintings that were sent abroad. An engraving by Noël Lemire, accompanied by a companion print of Lafayette, depicted the general in a military camp setting, littered with treaties, dispatches, bills, and the Declaration of Independence. Also based on a Peale painting is the 1785 print by Valentine Green, one of England's best Mezzotint engravers. Here, the rich blacks of the heavily worked Mezzotint plate show off to great advantage, while to my eye, it doesn't show the animation and depth of character that we find in Peale's own Mezzotint prints. Its superior finish and handsome military presence would have been impressive to an American audience. The same can be said of Valentine Green's 1781 Mezzotint after a painting by John Trumbull. In contrast to these, John Norman's enthusiastic attempts seem awfully crude, if not preposterous. Norman and his partners sold their interest in the Boston magazine a few months after the Washington engraving was published. Unfortunately, the new publishers were not at all impressed with Norman's ingenuity. In the Boston Gazette, they announced they were discontinuing the plates, noting that a number of their customers had found great fault with the cuts as being badly executed. Norman responded immediately, blaming the omission of the plates on the refusal of the new publishers to pay him. It's hard to know the accuracy of either claim, but if readers had indeed complained, you can hardly blame them. I have to admit, however, a soft spot in my heart for John Norman, laboring over his copper plate, trying to squeeze one more bare breast in there between the strings of the lyre. Norman was indefatigable in spreading the Peale-faced image of the commander-in-chief. And he created images that could be copied by even less skilled relief cut artists onto blocks that would be in continual use during the 1780s and 1790s. The constant appearance of the general's face throughout the war and immediately afterwards is really nothing short of amazing. We can't know, But we can't discount the notion that those cannons and banners encouraged the ragtag Revolutionary Army, or that the occasional cartouche, leafy swag, or figure of fame heightened Washington's dignity in some small measure. And the dissemination of the face alone must have had an impact. It wasn't just those who had seen Peale's paintings, like members of the Continental Congress, or the urban middling sort able to purchase a fine imported engraving. Washington's portrait was available to children, farmers, women readers of the magazines, soldiers intrigued by a new federal song, and anyone who found it useful to buy an almanac. So, if we can see that the face of Washington had much greater and deeper penetration into that wartime society than we might have guessed, let us take a look at a somewhat faster pace at some of the images that dominated after the war. A small etched profile by Joseph Wright, made around 1790, has always fascinated me because it was printed on cardstock. This made it ideal for sending through the mail. Thomas Jefferson purchased one in June 1790, which he mailed to his daughter Martha Jefferson Randolph. Diarist William Bentley noted the receipt of a mailed copy in December, a gift from his friend Benjamin Goodhue. Perhaps because of its small size and easy transportability, the Wright profile, a strong, determined-looking face, became an instantly popular presidential image and was widely copied in prints, medallions, relief cuts, and medals, both here and abroad. One use of the profile was in the second state of Amos Doolittle's large and ambitious Display of the United States of America. This celebration of the Constitution and the new federal government enclosed the portrait in a ring of interlocking seals representing the United States and the 13 original colonies. Washington, described as the President of the United States, the protector of his country, and the supporter of the rights of mankind, is elevated here to a major role as the central figure of the newly strengthened federal government. The shift from a loosely connected federation of states split by factional differences to a nation unified under a strong central government was a crucial change in our history. Doolittle celebrated the Constitution and its import by presenting that strengthened executive power dramatically and symbolically within the visually indissoluble unity of interlocking circles. Edward Savage's portraits were also prominent during the presidency. Savage's three-quarter-length mezzotint image, published in London in 1793, depicts Washington seated at a table contemplating the new federal city. It had all the refinement of the British technique, softness of texture, subtlety of shading, and richness of effect that made the English mezzotint so popular. Furthermore, it had the advantage of showing Washington out of uniform, dressed in an elegant and very presidential black suit. Guests describing the, quote, tall, manly figure of Washington clad in black velvet were very impressed with his magnificent presence. This was also an important symbolic addition to Washington's iconography. He is no longer just the soldier, but the statesman. The peaceful succession of one elected president to the next had yet to be proven, and to some, a very military president might have had dictatorial potential. Washington himself fully understood the importance of his appearance and his clothing. So did many printmakers, and the handsome Savage mezzotint also spawned numerous copies, both separate framing prints and book illustrations. At this point, in the 1790s, the book arts were developing fast, particularly in Philadelphia, the capital of the book trade. English engravers arriving in America found steady work illustrating Bibles, books, and magazines. Bookstores would also have on display and for sale the latest framing prints, either imported or made locally. Stipple engraving was replacing the laborious mezzotint technique because it was faster and easier, and the copper plates that combined line and stipple engraving could survive many more printings without loss of detail. Portraits of Washington, copied from Peel, Trumbull, Wright, Savage, and eventually Gilbert Stuart, proliferated in book and magazine illustrations. Here is one example, a frontispiece for a Philadelphia edition of Tobias Smollett's History of England. It is a modest little engraving, but exudes an extra gravitas through the embellishments beneath the portrait. The knight's helmet, sword, and baton, a symbol of military strength, as well as olive and oak branches, which symbolized respectively peace and strength. Together, these emblems implied that Washington's leadership enabled the peace that comes through military strength. The inscription on this piece indicates the designer of the print was John James Barillett, an eccentric and irascible Irishman who arrived in America and took up the embellishment of Washington portraiture where John Norman had left off. Slightly earlier, Barillett had designed a handsome framing print of Washington based on a miniature by Walter Robertson. The oval-framed portrait rests on the back of a handsome eagle, which also bears a baton, the scales of justice, and an E pluribus unum ribbon. Barillett didn't stop there. Military banners, the palm branches of victory, the liberty cap on a sword, the word libertas in a laurel wreath, all aim upwards towards encircling clouds and a radiating sun. We might keep 2 points in mind in considering this handsome but seemingly heavy-handedly symbolic engraving. First of all, Norman's and Barillett's use of symbol and allegory was a universal language. You didn't have to be an upper-class man with a classical education to understand the figure of fame, the liberty cap, the rattlesnake, or the implications of a laurel wreath, military paraphernalia, or the national eagle. Secondly, this print was advertised and subscriptions were solicited in 1795 during Washington's conflicted second term in office. Internal struggles, such as the Whiskey Rebellion, along with controversial foreign entanglements resulting in Jay's Treaty, created contentious debate, and the president himself was viciously assaulted in the public press by political enemies. In the middle of this difficult moment, with scurrilous attacks on the general's character, Barillett has introduced the radiating light and clouds of apotheosis imagery, presenting Washington as nearly godlike. Within this context, the profusion of accessible patriotic symbolism does not seem arbitrary or overdone, but a serious counterweight to negative publicity. Washington designed several other engraved portraits of Washington, repeating similar embellishments. General Washington's resignation, published as an illustration in the Philadelphia Magazine and Review in January 1799, is one of my favorites, because it pairs a symbolic temple of fame with the very real Mount Vernon mansion. In an explanation of the frontispiece, the print is called An Emblem of the American Cincinnatus Retiring from Public Office, and it thereby relates Washington's 1783 resignation of his military commission to his 1797 retirement from the presidency after his second term. In this scene, adorned with Barillett's eagle, along with his signature helmet, sword, and baton, Washington surrenders his symbols of power to the figure of America, who holds an Indian calumet. He points with his other hand to Mount Vernon, with the plow parked in front as a reference to the legendary Roman leader Cincinnatus. What makes this little print even more fascinating is its connection to another element of the visual culture of the day, completely lost to future generations. Public spectacles often include something called at the time a transparency, which was a large painting on oiled paper. That is what made it transparent and, unfortunately, very flammable. lit from behind by candles. Needless to say, these images, made for parades, ceremonies, and other public gatherings, didn't have much life expectancy. Those that survived the evening without bursting into flame were doomed by the oil and the size of the fragile paper. So they don't exist today, but they had an important public presence. The explanation of the frontispiece here actually describes the event that preceded it, which started with a splendid public dinner at Oyler's Hotel held in March 1797 to honor Washington on the occasion of his retirement. After dinner, the guests marched to an amphitheater called Brickett's Circus, where there was a special entertainment featuring, quote, a transparent full-length female figure as large as life representing America. The explanation goes on to proudly itemize all the symbolic components that you see here. Clearly, Bareillet was the designer of the transparency as well as the print, and we're lucky to have a lasting version of his conception of the grand celebratory spectacle. Don't miss the cornucopia at the bottom with the eagle, a much more common and, I must say, more successful implication of the prosperity of the new nation than Norman's multi-breasted figure on the picture. I won't linger long on Bareillet's last visual ode to Washington's virtues. The Apotheosis of Washington, later called the Commemoration of Washington, was designed shortly after Washington's death and first advertised in December of 1800. In addition to Father Time raising Washington from the tomb, you will recognize the familiar helmet, sword, and baton, as well as the eagle, shield, and ribbon, the mourning figure of America with her liberty cap, and a grieving Indian. In addition to the amalgam of classical Christian and national references, draped over the side of the tomb are the medals of the Order of the Freemasons and the Order of the Cincinnati. This tour de force was reissued over the years and copied for Liverpool pictures and Chinese reverse paintings on glass. Really, that story belongs to the 19th century and the generation eulogizing Washington. But its conception at the time of his death does, I think, help to reinforce the idea that Bareillet's visual enhancement to Washington's face and reputation, like Norman's, were widely disseminated and understood by the president's own contemporaries. You will have noticed that the face in this image is recognizably the one by Gilbert Stuart, best known in the so-called Athenaeum portrait, now at the National Portrait Gallery, which would come in the 19th century to dominate all other faces of Washington. And I, too, am looking forward to Ellen Miles' talk tomorrow about Stuart. Once again, a look at the prints enriches the Stuart story, showing the Athenaeum portrait attained currency before Washington's death. A recently arrived English engraver, David Edmund, engraved the Athenaeum head at least 3 times in 1798. Here are some examples. In part through Edmund's efforts, it became quite popular that year and appeared in multiple framing prints and illustrations. A New York physician named Charles Buxton, for example, designed an ambitious full-length image of Washington engraved by Cornelius Thibaut in 1798. Buxton's design was an amalgam of patriotic symbols referring to Washington's achievements and his role in forging the new nation. The figure stands on a pedestal between obelisks labeled liberty and independence. Masonic imagery abounds in the architecture and includes the pot of incense representing a pure heart. The other elements of Buxton's emblematic scheme would have been familiar to his audience. The background scene, however, introduces a new note, the view of Bowling Green, New York, depicting an empty pedestal where a statue of George III stood before being pulled down by a crowd of patriots. Washington then stands on his pedestal as a symbolic replacement for the toppled king. Buxton sent proof copies of his print to Washington, including this one, printed on satin, which fortunately eventually made its way back to Mount Vernon. The print was published by bookseller Charles Smith in New York and dedicated to the Congress of the United States, with the optimistic notion, no doubt, that each of those distinguished politicians might be potential subscribers. But as we have seen, there was a range of Washington prints, from the large, sophisticated, highbrow endeavors to the modest efforts available to every man, woman, and child. So I would like to return us to where we began, patriotic music. Another of David Edwin's engravings of 1798 was a very tiny version of the Gilbert Stuart face. This print seems to have been made specifically to insert in the title of a music sheet. In April of 1798, Joseph Hopkinson composed a piece called The Favorite New Federal Song, known as Hail Columbia, written for his friend, the singer and actor Gilbert Fox. At that moment, war with revolutionary France appeared almost inevitable, and tensions were mounting in Philadelphia between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Imagine that, partisan tension in the capital city. Fox hoped a patriotic song might rise above the divisive debates and inspire a unified American spirit. And indeed, his performance was a triumphant success. Abigail Adams attended the theater that evening and reported the next day that her head still ached from the thunderous applause. Immediately, Hail Columbia did become a favorite new national song demanded by audiences everywhere. 2 days after Fox's performance, the first published edition appeared with a small engraving of President John Adams pasted into the center of the title. But in July 1798, as the quasi-war against French privateers threatened to explode, George Washington briefly returned to public service when he was appointed once again Commander-in-Chief of the American forces. The enterprising publisher of the sheet music, Benjamin Carr, saw an opportunity for new sales. He didn't even have to reprint the music, since the little engraving was mounted on the sheet, glued at the top in the middle of the title. Apparently encouraged by the sales, Benjamin Carr repeated his formula by mounting Edwin's little engraving on another patriotic song entitled Brother Soldiers All Hail. But Carr and the fellow in his shop with the glue pot must have been especially busy in December 1799, just after the announcement of Washington's death. Carr himself composed the Dead March and Monody, played for Washington's funeral in Philadelphia on December 26, 1799, and he published the sheet music on December 31st. It was advertised as having an elegant likeness of the late general. So what can we conclude from these remains of a visual culture we still understand incompletely? We know the written record from his contemporaries that details Washington's physical presence, his vigorous heroism, his steadiness and moral courage. But to my mind, the visual depictions of Washington during his own life also help us to see the development of his reputation in the public imagination. The effect of a single crude almanac cut is impossible to gauge. When you consider all this pictorial material together, however, there is a cumulative effect from which we can legitimately extrapolate meaning. Consider the penetration into all levels of society of an authentic likeness. Consider the enhancement of those portraits with widely understood symbolic and allegorical embellishments. Let us not discount the context of a Washington portrait hovering over patriotic words set to a stirring, familiar tune. Is it too much to suggest that Edwin's little stipple engraving of the Stuart face of Washington had greater impact as the grieving nation considered the lyrics? With honor crowned, mature in age, he fell, the wonder of mankind. Laden with laurels, left the stage, nor leaves, alas, his like behind. Thank you very much. Stephen tells me we have time for about 2 questions. Yes, in the front. I think there's a microphone coming.
Just quick about how much were they selling for in today's currency?
I'm not very good at translating such currency fluctuations. I think the almanacs were very cheap. The broadsides were very cheap. I think a nice framing print would be a little bit more expensive. There is some indication that Savage's prints, for instance, sold for a few dollars. They would cost more if they were framed. So I think there was a range is the answer. I think there was a real range of costs. One more question? Yes, in the middle here.
Could you comment on negative images? Could you comment on negative images of Washington during this period, what we might call political cartoons and other such things?
Very good question. There was very little. There's enormous, as I mentioned, enormous amount of attacks on Washington's character in the press, in the pamphlet wars, but not in the visual imagery. There really is very little. There might be one or two cartoons known. We really don't know of a lot of them. There's very little. It's a good question. Thank you all so much for this.
All right, we're going to break now. There's a reception waiting right outside in the lobby. We also, during the reception, have opportunities for you to go up and tour the mansion. There will be members of our interpretive staff waiting outside by the glass doors in red sweaters, and they'll take groups. Once they get a group of about 20 people or so, they'll take you up to the mansion. But we're going to do those staggered until 6 o'clock. So the last tour will leave the lobby at 6 p.m. We have dinner starting at 6:30 over at the Mount Vernon Inn. Thank you. Honey, do you have a thingy to put on your...
Good stuff.
Are these your purchases here?
She's an honest group.
Carol, don't trip over the thing.
I won't. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, he really wasn't looking
Where does your family live?
What are you doing?
Well, you know, one thing that brought me back from and there they talk about
Jared was in there.
At one time, that was the principal rail hub of the United States.
And that's where Lincoln.
That's right.
Yes,
That's right.
and I was walking around. And I saw where Lincoln. I think we should get a
Once you find it, once you get the best
I'm sorry. That's okay. Did you enjoy that? Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Well, I'm an artist, so I'm enjoying listening about Peel and Rembrandt. You know, all of them. I don't think so. It meant to the generation.
You see them all the time. He's always in the house.
Yeah. So it's fun.
I understand that.
Yeah. Thank you. You too.
Oh, no problem. No. I was making more concerned about this question. No, it's fine. Oh, yeah. Oh, I appreciate it. But yeah, we just
That's what I read it.
Sounds good.
Where'd our carts go, Bob? Yeah. To the left. Back.
It's right towards the left.
Yeah, because I didn't see him back there.
Testing 1, 2. Bring that back up. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2.
I'm really well.
Thanks for doing the second half. Yeah, I didn't even notice that. No, I can't.
Test, 1, 2.
I can't
Test,
abide
1,
by
2.
that sometimes.
Test.
No, it's like, I know exactly what you mean. Occasionally, something real big, but like a little Chanel number 5, that works. You know what I mean? That's fine. That's great. But when you just get some like slathered on, way too much.
Seriously, when I get a good slam.
Give me a hand with this thing so we can get this off. No. It's okay. Just in the heavy. Like this. Just put it in here. Just to get it in a state where we can start putting some shit in here, you know? You know what I'm saying?
I'll go from here and there, whatever you want to do.
Still, the last lady specifically asked to have it.
That was my take. This is front sorry. Excuse me. Pardon us. Oh, we'll go on the tour.
You go on the tour?
We'll go on the tour.
You can come back and get this later then. Go ahead.
All right, where was I?
Paul. Is that a VGA in here, or was there a...
Tape to throw away here?
I gave it to him.
It's like I have an idea what I'm doing this weekend. I'll really find out when I get home, like around 11:30 tonight. I'll get a rundown of what has to be done. But I'm going to be giving a heads up until then. Yeah, that sounds better.
Are you wrapping that same one, Bob?
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Get it right out of your way. As best we can. Sorry.
What else is there here?
I got it.
I got some tape for you here.
How would that this? Beautiful fantastic.
Great pit. With Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman.
Yeah.
Must have been the biggest in your class.
Have some soup.
The way it does the ladle. That soup is so hot. Just like a cigar. Must have been the biggest in your class. I could have slept great like the straight man. Well, you know, I'm motivated. Faster we get out of here, faster we get out of here, the faster we get out of here.
Yes. It's Friday night.
Yeah, exactly.
Weekends are coming, right?
Exactly. There you go. All right, we're doing pretty good. I think we've got everything over here. Goes in the
The soft case goes in the soft case.
This go in the soft case?
Yeah. Yes.
This is easy.
Headset's got to go in here.
Yeah, headsets go in the soft case. All the cables, soft cases, the power strips.
Pay attention to that shit. I used to know. It's left my feeble gray matter.
Shorty now?
Pardon me.
You got a shorty? I used to have a shorty. Then I stretched it out. All my life. Close the door a few times.
I just can't say anything without being offensive.
Say what? I was gonna say this is what could you say to us that would
No,
be
I know,
offensive?
but with other people, you know.
Tape on the floor.
Oh, you got the P2?
Yes, I do.
Yep.
And the and the duplication sheet. That's
Yeah, I know.
There's like 2 DPAs in there.
No, you're right. Oh, over here I got it. I can hear it. Yeah.
Is this all the yeah.
We're down in like 10 minutes. That's crazy. I love it. But
So much,
it's crazy.
so much easier to tear down.
Yeah, I
You
guess
don't have to,
it's true.
you don't have to be precise. Yeah.
It helps to do this like 200 times a year too.
Okay, let's just do one check for Dan for taking.
that's the
Let's
soup.
look along the cable line.
That's nuts.
It's like glorified still camera.
No, it's a film camera by Canon.
Yeah.
It's their C camera. which you can put any kind of lens on.
Yep. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Oh, we're all good. Kind of polite.
I can get that out if you want to just go and get the vehicle. Vehicle's close, so let's just, I'll bring it around.
You sure?
I think that I've got
I got it.
Oh, you got your sack. You got your sack. It's good enough.
Okay.
And then for overnight, do you go back here?
It's gonna be locked.
Okay. There we go. So funny.